Welcome to another episode of Rose Resource Room. Today, I have an amazing guest. We just had a spirited conversation backstage, and I can't wait to bring you back in. So, let me give you a quick background. I went to the library, and for 3 years, I knew I was supposed to read this book, and the book, The Well-Trained Mind, was just sitting there calling my name. So, I took the book, and I could not put it down. And as I got to chapter 2, I said, I need to meet her. I need to speak to this woman. So, welcome to the show, Susan. Thank you so much for answering a yes from a random person.
Oh, thank you. It is my pleasure.
All right, so I'm really happy to have you. For those who do not know you, like where have they been, right? Just give us a quick intro and share where you are in your homeschool journey.
Okay. So I am the mother of four adults who were homeschooled, went to college. My youngest actually graduated from Holland University here in Virginia. They all went to Virginia schools in the spring and is currently doing a gap year, earning some money to go and do her Master of Fine Arts degree. So I am through with that part of my journey. I was homeschooled myself starting in 1972-ish. My mother was a school teacher and did not like her local school options and struck out to educate us on her own. I have an older brother and a younger sister. So I guess you could say I've been in homeschooling for 52 years. One way and another. I am glad to be on this side of the hard work part of it
Yeah.
with kids in K through 12. But of course, it gives you sort of an interesting perspective when you've been a homeschooled student and then you have homeschool students who are now adults. I think that's kind of a length of experience that a lot of people in the homeschool world don't yet have. We'll have more and
Right.
more people as time goes on. Um, so my mom and I wrote The Well-Trained Mind together in 1999, which was just an outline basically of what she had done with me and my
Mhm.
brother and sister, and what I intended to do with my own children. And we've revised it 5 times. So each revision, I think, owes a little bit more to the experiences I was going through with my own children.
Right.
So the most recent edition of The Well-Trained Mind, which is what we're calling the Essential Edition, is really a kind of a boiled down to the basics. Here is what a classical education is. Here is how you do it at home.
Perfect. Now let's stay there. What exactly is a classical education? Because, like we were talking about, there's this buzzword and everyone is using it. We've had different deviations. We've had classical plus, classical minus. So, in your mind's eyes, what is that
Right.
supposed to really be?
It's funny, The Well-Trained Mind came out when it first came out in 1999. My mom and I noticed a couple years later that a lot of curricula, which had been around for a long time and had never used the word classical, were suddenly calling themselves classical.
Interesting.
Yeah, that happened. Um, I have said often, and I will say it again, that what we recommend in the well-trained mind is what I would call neoclassical, which is that we're taking principles of the traditional classical model. And let me just specify, when we're talking about a classical model, even in those very narrow terms, we're not talking about what the Greeks and Romans did. We're talking about how medieval and Renaissance church schools reinterpreted the principles of Greece and Rome in order to train clergymen. That is the
Mhm.
basis of what in the 19th century would have just been called a traditional liberal arts education. That's the root of that Western tradition. So it was since the Middle Ages, it hasn't been classical in that it's not what the Greeks and Romans did.
Right.
It's been an interpretation of those principles for modern times. The medievals were their own moderns. The Renaissance was its own modernity. Now we are in the 21st century. So I like to call what we do neoclassical because it's taking those principles again and saying, you know, the medieval and Renaissance church schools didn't pay a whole lot of attention to math and science because they were training clergymen. They paid a lot more attention to the language arts. But in the 21st century, we don't have that luxury. We've got to be competent in math and sciences as well. So you're always reinterpreting that tradition to make it work for modern times. So I
Right.
like to use the word neoclassical for what we do. Um, the problem with the popularity of the word classical is that it is applied to a lot of different methods that I would not call neoclassical.
Mm.
Um, the Christian classical movement, and I am actually a Christian. I was a minister's wife, or I'm still a minister. Well, he's retired now. He's still alive, doing well, folks. I was a minister's wife for almost 35 years.
Yeah.
Um, and I am, the worship of God is still a huge part of my daily life and weekly routine. But classical Christian education, which sometimes seems to be identified almost seamlessly with classical education without the Christian,
Mm,
is a particular reinterpretation of that liberal arts tradition that relies very heavily on a certain strain of very conservative reformed theology as part of its learning, part of its teaching, sort of part of its DNA.
hmm
Um, so I have had numerous interactions with folks who are on the very committed classical Christian side of things, where they have said such things as, well, unless you acknowledge that Christ is Lord, you can't even be confident that 2 + 2 = 4. And that is a really strong thread in a lot of classical Christian education, that there is no knowledge apart from Christ. And as a neoclassical educator and someone who has actually a 3-year MDiv theology degree, I'm like, okay, actually, Calvin and Luther both believed in common grace, which is that God has revealed himself in the world in a way that we can trust no matter what our faith commitment is. And that is a bedrock principle of neoclassical education. So there are ways in which, particularly the more conservative strands of classical Christian education, to me, sort of go counter to the intention of the classical education that I love.
Interesting. Thank you so much for sharing that. I hear what you're saying and I really understand your perspective. Um, Practically speaking, if you
Mhm.
were supposed to apply a neoclassical approach to your home-centered education,
Mhm.
if you said you follow the trivium and how the child learns, would that
Mhm.
kind of be in the right direction solely? Or what else would you need to add to say that you're doing neoclassical?
Well, oh, that's such a big question. Okay. So, first of all, to me, what is most important about the neoclassical education that I write about and have
Hmm
practiced and talk about is this idea of the trivium, that the grammar, logic, and rhetoric that was part of the resurrection of classical education in the medieval and Renaissance church schools was reimagined in the early 20th century, along with the help of educational psychology, as, this is actually how the mind works.
hmm
There's grammar, which is the structure, the facts, the things that we're learning, like the raw matter. There's logic, which figures out how you're fitting those three things, how those things all fit together, and evaluating them. And then there's rhetoric, which is speaking persuasively about them, which means you have to have an opinion. You have to make up your mind. You have to know these things and understand their connections well enough to speak them yourself.
That's right.
Yeah, so that to me is really what's at the center of neoclassical education. And it pulls in all of these threads from the Greeks and Romans through the Middle Ages, through the Renaissance, through the early 20th century. And there was a lot that was good about the educational psychology of the early 20th century right on into the present.
Mhm.
So, to me, if you're taking those stages of development seriously, and I often say to people, those stages are not meant to restrict a student, right? You don't say to a third grader, I'm sorry, you can't ask questions of logic because you're only in third grade. They're
Right.
meant to protect younger students from being asked to do too much too early,
Right.
because there are a lot of curricula, and this is particularly true in both private and public schools, that are very testing focused.
Right.
There are a lot of curricula that push sort of logic and rhetoric stage tasks back to younger and younger grades in an attempt to get kids to score higher and seem like they've got a higher level of achievement.
Mm,
When what you're actually asking them to do is to operate beyond their maturity level, which is generally just a recipe for tears
that's right.
or shutting off.
That's right.
So if you're taking that seriously and paying attention to the development of your child's mind, I think you're doing neoclassical education. Now, of course, there are all sorts of other things that can be brought into this. What books are you reading?
Right.
What languages are you studying? How are you doing history? But to me, all of those things are less constitutive of what I would call a neoclassical education than paying close attention to those developmental stages.
Perfect. Thank you. That really helps. So, question for you. We've often heard classical education described as rigorous, right? And there's several reminders in your book that
Hmm.
talks about tailoring content as needed, right? So for the type A person, hey, Ro, you don't have to do every single book or every single question. If there's 200, you can just choose a few, right?
Hmm.
So what would you suggest to a parent who's trying to balance much
Hmm.
needed academic rigor, because we do need it, right?
Yes. Hmm.
Without creating that overwhelm or that unintentional pressure that you just spoke about.
Yeah. Well, I think the important thing to keep in mind is the difference between skill areas and content areas.
Hmm.
So, skill areas are the ones that the student must master in order to be able to appreciate content. So, that means skill areas are reading, writing, spelling, arithmetic, right? Having a really firm grasp of all of those skills, and we call them skills because they're not things that they're things we do, right? We
Right.
use skills of reading, we use the skills of writing, we use the arithmetic. We use those skills in order to investigate this huge field of knowledge, which is science and history and literature and all that great stuff. Rigor in the skills is absolutely necessary because those are the tools that we're giving students so that they can like dig through the fields of the content areas.
Right.
In the content areas, you really have to be more delight led.
Mm.
And you also have to come to terms with and be at peace with the fact that you're never going to do it all. There's too much. There's too
Yeah.
much. This is one of the ways in which neoclassical education really departs from its classical roots. There, in classical times, there was a very small set of literature and
Mm.
an even smaller set of scientific principles that you had to master in order to know as much as the greatest scholar out there. Today, there's no way. I mean, knowledge has multiplied so exponentially. You're
Mhm.
never going to get through all the history. You're never going to get through all the science. You're never going to get through it all. So you have to allow students to go deeper rather than always pushing them to go wider in the
Mhm.
content areas. And again, this is hard for a lot of type A parents. Be at peace with the idea that you're going to miss something. You're going to miss
Mhm.
something. That's going to happen. You're going to Okay. May I tell your listeners a terrible, terrible thing?
Tell us.
One of my children, grown children, and I will not out to you which child this is.
One of the four.
One of the four said to me the other day, "So I think I'm going to switch my bank account. So I guess I need a new debit card. Can I get Discover?" And I said, "Okay, Discover is a credit card." And this child said to me, "What's the difference between a debit card and a credit card?" And I was like, "Oh my gosh, we totally missed that."
Right. No, no, no. I hear
You
you.
know? Well, every parent has had this experience, right?
Right.
Um, so there's going to be, one day one of your adult children will turn around and say, "What is this World War II that people keep talking about?" I don't remember that, anything about that. You have to be at peace with that because if you're giving them rigor in the skills, then they've got the tools they need to go and find
That's
what
right.
they do.
That's
Yeah.
right. I cannot tell you how encouraging that is. I finally, probably like a year ago, said, you know what? I give up. I'm not going to be able to read every single book on whatever list I have, and that's okay. But the reason I mentioned that is because there's always that pesky little feeling of, am I doing enough? Right.
Mhm.
And one person said to me that gaps are inevitable. And at
Mhm.
first I was like, what's the point? That I need to go harder to make sure that, that's not our case. But it was so reassuring to understand there will be gaps and that's okay. And like
Yeah,
for me, I don't know how to change a tire. I'm an
right.
adult, but that's a gap, right? So for my
Mhm.
kids, I started to slowly start to listen to exactly what you just said in terms of you will miss something, but if you
Mhm.
gave them the tools and foster that love of learning, then eventually they can go back. With YouTube University, they can learn anything, right? But I think sometimes what I do is probably what public school does, which is the just in case learning. I'm going to
Mhm.
teach you this just in case you end up
Right.
being that. I'm going to teach you this just in case you end up being this. And let me
Mhm.
tell you, my boys are 2, 8, and 10.
Oh,
Like
you're right in the middle of it.
I'm in the weeds and the trenches and all the things that they say, but I'm like, oh, but what if he becomes this? Then he needs to know that. But to
Mhm.
your point, what I'm doing is I'm going wide, but not allowing them to go deep based on their interest. So
Yep.
thank you for
Yeah.
helping this type A mama's heart.
Well, being a type A mama is hard. I'm one myself. But I think that what you have to recognize when you're homeschooling is that impulse, that not impulse, that fear of I'm going to miss something
Mm,
is really that actually doesn't have anything to do with education. That has to do with parenting. Because just as if you weren't homeschooling your boys, you would still be saying to yourself every day, am I spending enough time with them?
that's
Am I,
right.
do we have the right balance? Am I doing enough? What am I missing? Am I treating this the right way? Am I letting them have bad habits? Should I have let them play that video game for an hour? What if they end up living under a bridge in a cardboard box because I didn't insist that they put the video game down? And you know, these anxieties as parents are just ever present and they never go away.
Mm,
They're always in the back of your mind.
or forefront.
Or forefront. I know. They're just there all the time. And I know that as a parent of young children myself, and I had three boys and then my daughter at the tail end. I feel you. Um, I and I lost my mom in November.
Oh,
Um,
wow. My
yeah, well,
condolences. I saw that.
yeah, she was 87. She was ready. Um, but I used to go down to see her because they lived in an apartment attached to like a grandparent apartment attached to ours. I would go down and say, "Mom, are the kids okay?" Yes, they're fine. You're doing a good job. You're
Mm,
spending lots. Everything is fine. We all need someone to reassure us that we're doing a good job just as parents.
that's right.
Forget the whole educational part of it. It's just such a difficult
Mm,
job with no benchmarks,
that's right. That's
right?
right.
I mean,
And no manual.
no manual, no benchmarks. There's no tests to tell you if your kids are actually okay. We're just all hoping, right?
Yeah.
So then when you add education on top of that, I think a lot of the pressure that we feel is just a reflection of that generalized anxiety. It isn't necessarily education focused. So just sort of recognizing that.
Yeah.
And I can say this now on the other end of it because I look at 12 years of homeschooling with four different children, and I never once felt that I was doing enough.
Oh, wow.
So,
Right. No, that is so helpful. I think a lot of the concern is a double whammy when you home and educate because you don't have anyone to blame. You could say, oh, the public school didn't do right.
yep.
It's
Yeah,
so easy to say
exactly.
the schools did this or the pandemic, but then when they're home, it's like, oh, I guess this is on my watch, right? But to your point, I feel like what I do sometimes is I plant something and then I dig it up real quick. Did it grow? Did it grow? Right? Like
Yeah.
the that's not the way. So I understand why some curriculum or schools are so heavy in assessments because you want that kind of
Mhm.
approval or confirmation that you're doing the right thing. But to your point, it's just a part of the nature of the game.
It is, and the truth is, like beating off, trying to be wise and sensitive to your kids, and at the same time beating off fear is the big challenge of parenting and
Mm,
also of homeschooling. And I've said, and if your listeners have heard me on other podcasts, they've probably heard me say this because looking back, it's kind of my mantra, which is if you make a decision, whether it's a parenting decision or an education decision, not based on what's good right now or what is right for this child at this moment, but based on your fear of what you think is going to happen in the future, it's almost always the wrong decision. And
mm,
looking back at my educational journey with my children, I can say that with 100% certainty. The mistakes that I made that I wish I could take back were made because I was afraid they wouldn't be prepared for something that was down the road, not even in our
mm.
faces, not because I made that decision for their current well-being. And that's a hard one. That's a hard one because fear is a really powerful motivator.
It really is. And
Really
anxiety is
powerful
never
motivator.
something that I struggled with, never something that I dealt with, but I found myself at 1 o'clock in the morning researching something, at 2 o'clock looking at something. I'm like, you may not
Yeah.
want to call it that, but that's what it is, girl. You have to
Hmm.
figure out what's going on. I actually saw a blog post early in my homeschooling. I say early, I've only been doing it 3 years, but probably a couple months into my homeschooling. And it said, here are X reasons not to homeschool. And it was
Hmm.
exactly what you just said. If you're doing it because you're afraid of X, that's probably not the best reason to do it. If you're doing it because you're concerned about Y, that's not the
Hmm.
reason, right?
Yeah.
And then they gave the positive reasons, the do's of homeschooling.
Right. Right. That's so interesting. And if you don't mind me giving a little plug for my own podcast,
Let's
we've
do
got
it.
a third season of the Well-Trained Mind podcast coming up. And I'm not giving you a release date yet because we don't have one. We're doing all the recordings now. But one of the things we're the sort of the theme of the season is we're interviewing homeschool parents whose kids have graduated
Mm,
to say, all right, now let's look back together, you know.
yeah.
And the thing that really stands out among what I would call successful homeschool parents, meaning that they got through and the kids are okay.
Everybody's alive.
Everybody's alive. Well, but not only that, but the kids, have found their way. The
Okay.
kids have found their way and they're still on good terms with their parents. That's how I would define successful. That's really
Right.
important. Almost, actually, so far, everyone came into homeschooling not with the attitude of, oh, I've got to protect these children and hem
Yeah.
them in and make sure that they're okay, but more with the attitude of, well, we can do this.
Yeah.
It can't be that hard. That's actually not true. But most of the successful parents we've talked to, they went into it with, well, we can do this. We're competent adults. Let's figure it out and go do it. More a sense of adventure than
Mm,
of than a sense of anxiety and
mm.
protectionism, I guess.
I appreciate that. I was literally thinking this morning, I said to my kids, I said, guys, let's just get through March. We're going to hone in on the core skills, pretty much what you talked about, like the reading, writing,
Yep.
spelling, and arithmetic. We're going to hone in on this. And then April is going to look like the reason I actually wanted to homeschool. Like, let's put in the pool, let's put in more park days. Let's like we go to the library, we do a lot of things, right? But I
Mhm.
felt it becoming very mundane. Like
Yeah.
I had a list of things I wanted them to do on Monday. And then Tuesday we took off because it was a baby's birthday. And then Wednesday I was like, yeah, same list. And I'm like, it just felt so mundane. And I'm like, I need to go back to my why, kind of to your point of how they started, like
Right.
the approach and the adventure, all that. It was never, I want to make sure they have the best handwriting. I want to make sure they're matching. That was never my why. But I
Right.
get so bogged down into the, I
Mhm.
need to make sure that they're okay in the future, that
Yep.
we're not fully in the present.
You're not in the present. And that is the challenge, not just for our kids, but I just think for life too. And, you'll find I'm 56, so I've got a few years on you. But you'll find as you move on into middle age that that becomes even more important to realize that you're not, because, as you get a little bit older, your future kind of gets a little shorter, right? And you have to start thinking to yourself, okay, well, at this point, I'm not going to go have a new career. I'm probably not going to move to the south of France, although I'm holding that one open.
That can still happen.
Um, but you have to become more present focused,
Hmm.
uh, because that's what you are given, and your body
Hmm.
starts to ache a little bit, and you're like, oh, I don't know, we're probably not going to hike the Camino Trail in 10 years when I'm nearly 70. It's just not going to happen. And then you realize how much of your life you've spent looking forward instead of living in the present, right?
Right.
And that, of course, that's a big part of the monastic impulse is to stop and say, what we have is today. And of course, when you're raising children, you have to look forward. I mean, you do have to give some thought to the future. You have to make sure that they've got the great credits when they're going into high school, and you have to help them look forward. But particularly when your children are young, that forward-looking focus can become an obsession and really block you off from the present. And I'm sure you're feeling that because your kids are at the age when that is particularly
Hmm.
an acute challenge, I think.
So then, how would you say that classical education prepares students for the modern world?
Well, I mean, the thing about neoclassical education
Neoclassical.
is it is really about it's about becoming a whole human being,
Mm,
right? So these stages of grammar, logic, and rhetoric aren't just about accumulate facts, figure out how they fit together, have an opinion about them. It's about taking knowledge and deciding whether or not you want that to be part of who you are.
mm,
Is this something that I find valuable? Is this something I'm going to take into myself? Is this something that I'm going to repeat to others? So, um, Aristotle famously said, and I'll paraphrase because I don't have the quote in front of me, but he famously said, in my own words, that people, men in particular, he was talking about, are ashamed of an inability to defend themselves with fists, right? So if you can't fight, you feel kind of embarrassed about that. But why are we not equally ashamed of an inability to defend our thoughts in speech and writing? Because what we think is more diagnostic of humanity. It is more who we are as people. than is the use of our fists, which, any
Mm,
animal can kick and punch. But this is what makes us human. So classical education really is about developing yourself, developing a sense of who you are, what you believe, and why you believe it. And it doesn't matter what world you live in, whether it's ancient, medieval, Renaissance, or modern, that's going to equip you to live in that world with success.
yeah. And I can see how he must be turning in his grave because critical thinking seems to be as limited as common sense is these days. I mean,
Indeed.
like this whole logic, these fallacies of ad populum and ad hominem. Well, everybody believes it, or the
Yep.
circular reasoning. It's really sad
It
that
is. And no matter what side of the political divide you're on, you can see that the other side is accepting without question
yes,
things that should be questioned.
that's right.
And to question intelligently with information before you jump to the rhetoric stage, which is having an opinion. This is
Yeah.
one of the things that happens now is we just go straight to rhetoric. We just go straight to having an opinion and we don't talk about the facts or the assertions that can be drawn from those facts. That's not being fully human. That's being a
Mm,
mouthpiece for somebody else's ideas.
wow. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's absolutely right. I'm chewing on that a little bit because critical thinking is my biggest reason for wanting to do classical.
right.
So I said, I want two things. I want my children to have a broad worldview, not just know
Mhm.
one thing, but understand history and how that impacts current events. And then I
Mhm.
also wanted them to have a biblical worldview. And that part that you just talked about where people just accept things, not even caring who the source is or if the source did any research, that's the piece that I'm most concerned about.
Yep.
I
Yep.
don't want that for my children where they just said, oh, yeah, I heard it on TikTok, so it must be true. Or 10 of my
Yep.
friends said that, so it must be the right thing.
Listen, we had a rule in my house when my kids were teenagers, and I sometimes still enforce it now that they're in their 20s and 30s, is they and my kids would say this, and I'm sure you've heard this before. Well, they say, or they, and so I was like, okay, nope, hold the phone. We do not use the pronoun they. Who? Who said it?
Right. Right.
Let's just start there. And it was amazing to me how often they had no idea.
Yeah. And my
Yeah.
dad laughs about that. He said, that's why they call them they, because nobody knows, right? It's
Because
like
nobody knows exactly. Yeah.
these
And
random people.
the classical method of education pushes back against that and says, no,
Mm,
there is no they here.
I love that. I love
Yeah.
it. All right, so let's do a practical example. Let's see if I can make something up. All right, so you want to have a biblical worldview and you want to raise kids who are logical and engage in critical thinking. So if you're doing something in history,
Mhm.
what would that lesson look like in each phase? So
Well,
grammar, yeah.
okay, so let me start with saying that you got to be really careful with the biblical worldview part of it if we're talking about history, because it's super easy, and I hate curricula that do this actually, and there's way too many of them that say this happened. Here's what God was doing through that historical
I see.
event,
Hmm.
right? So that to me is not a biblical worldview. That to me is hubris and arrogance.
Mm.
Oh, is that what God was up to? Huh. You
Even
know?
though nobody knows his ways and his thoughts, but you know.
Nobody knows his ways and his thoughts,
Yeah.
right? So, I mean, having a biblical worldview, I think, means going into this with some humility.
Mm.
And of course, being willing to make moral judgments. This was a good and ethical and true and compassionate thing. This was not. I mean, a biblical worldview should most certainly um, make us very sensitive to the effects and the both well, no, I'm not gonna say motivations, the effects of historical events. How did this affect people? Was it good? Was it bad? According to the Gospels, were people cared for? That to me is a biblical worldview.
Hmm.
Um, in terms of the three stages, then, oh, I don't want to pick a really, really fraught one. Uh, I'm trying to think of a non-fraught historical event.
You mean something non-controversial like Columbus or something like
I was just about to say Columbus, and I was like, you know what? That's going to be another half-hour discussion, so let's not do that. Let's talk about
that?
the Industrial Revolution. How about
Okay.
that? Okay. And that's sort of big and impersonal. So the Industrial Revolution is the time beginning in England when factory work began to, because you could make more things cheaply faster in a factory, and you could pay people to make the things in the factory. And so people who could afford to build factories, pay people to work in them, then made a whole lot of money. And that began to empty out the traditional home-based industries, whether it's weaving or cheese making or whatever. The factories started to take over and do on a large scale what had previously been home businesses, on which the economy had rested until that point. So it's this massive economic shift. So let's imagine we're talking about now, you want to go biblical worldview. I would say, how were those people being treated?
Mhm.
Um, who was making the money and how were they using it? Were they using it to care for other people? What was the church doing at this time to look out for and shepherd the people? There's so many biblical worldview questions you could ask
Right.
there, right? Um, Many of which might have conflicting answers. That's part of the challenge with the biblical worldview, because people talk about it like it's this single link,
One. Hmm.
and it's so not. Um, so asking a lot of questions and coming up with all the different answers is a better way of doing it than saying, what did God intend with the Industrial Revolution, which I have seen, and it's not a good way to do history. Let's set that aside for the moment.
Okay.
Grammar stage Industrial Revolution. What happened and when did it happen? It's
Mm.
really just the facts,
Just
man.
the facts. Hmm.
Just the facts, because what you're trying to do is tell this story about this transition. The transition happened. Here is where it happened. Let's look at the map and the globe. Here
Hmm.
is when it happened. Here's the time frame. And here are the events that happened around it so we can put it in some sort of mental framework.
Right.
Logic stage, but why? Why
Mm.
did it happen? Why did it happen then and not 500 years earlier? What were the causes and effects? How were people's lives changed? What changed about the economy? What changed about the landscape? What changed about people's daily lives? Who benefited? Who profited? Who lost out? Those are all the logic stage questions. The rhetoric stage questions is, was this a good thing or a bad thing? And a lot of rhetoric stage questions come down to that, right?
Right.
I'm going to argue for the fact, and sort of another way to put that, not exactly the flip side, but maybe I'd call it the mirror image of that is, was this inevitable?
Mm.
Were there other ways that this could have gone? Are there ways, if you think there was damage, are there ways that it can be reversed? If you think it was a good thing, that's fine. Explain why it was good, but then also talk about the shadow side. Talk about the people whose livelihoods were lost, what happened to them. How did this, not just how did this shift society, but how did it make us more human or less human?
Mm.
Right. So the problem with and I'm glad we're talking about history because that's a content area.
Right.
The problem with talking about rigor is sometimes we try to push those questions back a little bit too early. So we're asking our grammar stage children how and why, or we're asking our logic stage students, was this a good thing or a bad thing?
Mm.
So one of the things I really love about the classical pattern is it says, no, there's time for that question later. Let's just get the facts down first,
Right.
right?
Right.
Which is a pattern of thought that's so important to becoming a clear thinker, right? You can't talk about whether the Industrial Revolution was good or bad. You can't talk about the winners and losers and what happened to them until you understand what happened and why and when, how it affected people. Then you can ask the bigger questions. Yeah.
This was a master course in less than an hour.
I like teaching. What can I say?
Thank you. All right, so I've been greedy and I've asked you a ton of questions. I usually hate when people ask me the one thing, but if there was something that you wanted
Mhm.
to share with everyone, whether it's something you wish you knew, did differently, or just like an encouraging message to anyone, what would that be?
Well, I think I would have, and this is so hard when you're in the middle of it. I would have liked to have been better at taking the long view. You get so
Mm.
wrapped up in the day to day and even the year to year that it's easy to think about the child as a project instead of a person. Yeah. It's like one of my hobbies is I ride horses. And there's two ways to train a horse, and one is you go in and you practice all the patterns and you practice the tests that you're going to have to write at the show until it's perfect. And that's treating the horse like a project. And the
Mm,
other way is you get on the horse and you're like, okay, horsey, how you doing today? What's up with you? How are your muscles feeling? What are you scared of? Let's talk about how we're going to get you to relax your neck and relax your jaw and stop trying to kill me. Let's just be like a horse, right? And children are the same way. It's so easy to get fixated on getting that workbook done. And okay, that's important.
yeah.
Getting that writing lesson done. And to forget that there's a whole complicated life going on behind that little face that you don't have any access to. All you can do is try to get some glimpses of it. So it's easy to forget that that's part of the big project of education.
Wow, that is pure gold. Thank you so, so much. I really appreciate your time here. I appreciate every nugget, every mindset shift. You are a wealth of information, and it was my absolute pleasure having you here.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm so glad that we could set this up.
Thank you.